In this section, we'll look at World War II as the foundation for the African American civil rights movement that flourished after the war. Certainly, during the war, almost a million African Americans served in the armed forces. Wartime needs forced the military to end policies of excluding African Americans from the Marines and Coast Guard and are restricting them to jobs as mess boys in the Navy or anyway, keeping them from non-combat units in the Army, all of which had gone on before. The number of black officers grew from 5 in 1940, 3 of which were chaplains, to over 7,000 in 1945. During the war, the all-black 761st Tank Battalion gained distinction fighting in Germany, and the 99th Pursuit Aero Squadron won 80 distinguished flying crosses for its combat against the German Luftwaffe in Europe. On the home front, a severe labor shortage meant opportunity for many African Americans. The great migration of blacks from the rural South to the urban North and West, which had been begun during World War I, picked up a pace. Over 700,000 African Americans migrated northward during the war, finding greater opportunities in the factories working under defense contracts. With their improving status came greater self-esteem, growing in part from the knowledge that they were fighting for freedom and against the white supremacist Nazis. But, ironically, as African Americans labored for their country, they continued to face discrimination. In the South, Jim Crow laws continued to enforce segregation and deny African American suffrage or voting rights. The great majority of African Americans continued to serve in segregated military units commanded by white officers. This indignity, made worse by the failure of military authorities to protect black servicemen off the post, and by the use of white military police to keep blacks, quote, in their place, it sparked rioting on Army bases. At least 50 African American soldiers died in race conflicts during the war. In the words of one famous blues guitarist, B.B. King, quote, I used to sing gospel songs until I joined the Army, then I sang the blues, unquote. As thousands of African Americans moved northwards, many whites, of course, resisted their settlement. Race riots in World War II erupted in 1943 in Harlem, Mobile, Alabama, and Beaumont, Texas. The bloodiest melee exploded in Detroit when a white mob attacked blacks riding on trolleys and attending a movie theater. Mobs of blacks subsequently attacked and looted white-owned businesses. It took almost 2 days to regain order, and by that time, 30 blacks and non-whites had died, with over 700 injured. As blood banks continued to separate white and black blood plasma, blacks complained that the defense industries discriminated in pay. While many African Americans were paid higher wages than previously, they still were not paid equally to the whites doing the exact same job. Supervisor jobs remained almost exclusively white. Moreover, the defense contracts, which of course was the real source of profit and wealth, went almost exclusively to white-owned businesses and factories. Some observers noted at the time the irony of increased African American opportunity and expectations together with the continued discrimination. Writing in 1944, the economist Schooner Myrdal stated that, quote, not since Reconstruction had there been more reason to anticipate fundamental changes in American race relations. There's bound to be a redefinition of the Negro's status as a result of this war. Indeed, during the war, you can see African Americans beginning to mobilize for equal rights. In Pittsburgh, the newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, began a campaign called the Double V campaign. It called for victory at both home and abroad. And what it would do is it get people carrying signs and giving speeches saying that we're fighting for freedom at both home and abroad, the Double V campaign. Realizing that African Americans were vital to the war effort, the labor leader A. Philip Randolph became the first great modern African American nonviolent civil rights activist. The leader of a railroad union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Randolph realized that if African Americans went on a strike and staged a 50,000-man, quote, thundering march, unquote, on Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt would have to act. With the U.S. fighting the Nazis, who claimed Aryans as a superior race, the United States would be embarrassed by having its own minority protesting. The German propaganda would have a field day, and it would make America's claims to be fighting for freedom appear hollow. Moreover, so important were African Americans to the war industries given the labor shortage, Roosevelt could not afford a disruption in the war effort. A march on Washington, Randolph stated, would, quote, Wake up and shock white America as has never been shocked before, unquote. Well, Randolph followed the lead of another contemporaneous nonviolent civil rights activist, Mahatma Gandhi in India. Roosevelt at first thought he could sweet-talk Randolph. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, was a well-known proponent of African American rights, and Roosevelt assumed that he could appeal to Randolph's patriotism. Roosevelt agreed to meet with Randolph at the White House, and during the meeting, Roosevelt told Randolph that he agreed about the discrimination, and the War Department was doing what it could to get everything better. Randolph, however, wasn't swayed and called for an executive order making it mandatory that African Americans be permitted to work in defense plants. Hesitating, Roosevelt agreed to a small committee to draft an executive order that Randolph would accept. Finally, in late June 1941, after rejecting several drafts, Randolph agreed to what became known as Executive Order 8802. Executive Order 8802 declared that it would be the policy of the United States, quote, that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin, unquote. The order meant that blacks could not be denied job training and must be paid the same as whites with the same skills. If the company didn't agree, it would not be eligible for the lucrative defense contracts. Moreover, the order promised that defense contracts would go to minority-owned factories. In a sense, this consideration of race in the awarding of contracts foretold affirmative action decades later. Finally, the order created the first new civil rights body in the government since Reconstruction, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, or the FEPC. The FEPC would monitor compliance. The order was sufficient for Randolph, who called off the march. There was no march. It was a victory for nonviolent civil rights protest, and it in many ways foretold Martin Luther King Jr. a decade later. The FEPC lacked adequate enforcement mechanisms, but the executive order was influential nevertheless. Between 1942 and 1945, the proportion of African Americans in war production rose threefold. African American membership in unions doubled, while the number of skilled African American workers tripled. Overall, the average wage for African Americans increased from $457 a year to just under $2,000 a year. As the war ended, African Americans felt like they had earned equality, and they recognized that organized, nonviolent activism did indeed pay dividends. This includes the section on World War II as the foundation for the African American civil rights movement.